In this video, we want to look at the so-called Catholic epistles. We want to begin with a general overview, and then we want to look in turn, just very briefly, at each one, specifically Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. When we think about the Catholic epistles, first of all, we should mention that they're not always called Catholic epistles. Sometimes they're called General Epistles. Actually, those two words, although they sound very different to our ears sometimes, they're actually trying to capture the same idea. Namely, a Catholic in the sense not the Roman Catholic Church, but Catholic meaning universal. And once we say universal, we can see, general, meaning not to a specific place or a specific person or specific church, but generally or universally to the whole body of Christ. So when we say Catholic epistle, don't think, I'm a Protestant, I don't need to pay any attention to this one. No, meaning to say it's written to a general audience. So maybe the better term for us is general epistles, so as not to confuse that. We should also recognize that not all of these epistles, epistle means letter, not all of these seem to be true letters. I talked about in another video about the Pauline Epistles being real letters written to real people. That seems a little bit less true, at least for some of these epistles, as we will see as we go forward. The last overview thing that I want to mention is canonical perspective. Remember we talked about canonical criticism in another video? Canonical criticism means looking at one of the meanings of canonical criticism is looking at the way that the letters were organized, or the books of the Bible were organized into sections, and what comes first, what comes second, and what is the meaning attached to the way it was put together. From a canonical perspective, we can say that these general epistles or Catholic epistles provide a corrective to a misreading of the Pauline Epistles. So if we read Pauline Epistles a particular way, if we push it too far, we can get it wrong. And these epistles correct that wrong reading of the Pauline Epistles. In particular, some people say, well, if to go back to that old center, the Reformation view of the center of Paul's letters as justification by faith. That's one way of reading it. And if we push that too far, we can end up saying, well, if justification is by faith and not works, that means works doesn't matter. That means all I need is faith, and works is nothing. The general epistles or Catholic epistles jump in and say, no, you can't read it that way. Works is still important. So it corrects this wrong reading of the Pauline epistles. If we focus in on Hebrews, the first thing that I want to mention is it's highly unlikely that they're Pauline. First of all, recognize, or I should say that it is Pauline. Recognize that it's not part of the Pauline corpus. Many people still want to say Paul wrote Hebrews, but that's really unlikely. First of all, because it's not part of the Pauline corpus, but secondly, because it's so different in its thought world from the Pauline epistles. I had mentioned in that video on the Pauline epistles that some of those Pauline letters that has Paul's name there, some of them are strongly disputed by scholars. But this one, Hebrews, even more. There are very few scholars that would accept Hebrews as being written by Paul. Now it's a bit ironic because the early church did think, or at least some people in the early church did think that Hebrews was written by Paul. In fact, some of the books or writings that made it into the New Testament or didn't make it into the New Testament, the decision was based on, did it go back to an apostle? And Hebrews was one of the last letters to get accepted widely as belonging in the New Testament. The reason it finally got in was because enough people were convinced that Paul wrote it. So there's an irony here. It got in, and it's good that it did because it belongs in, but it got in for the wrong reason. Nevertheless, it's in, and we're glad that it did. I want to also mention regarding Hebrews that it's better to understand it as a sermon with an epistolary or letter ending put on the end. It's a sermon, a long sermon. I think I once read it out loud from beginning to end, and it took, I forget exactly, but maybe about an hour and a half. So a bit longish for a sermon, although some people prefer sermons such length. But yeah, it's a sermon. It's intended for a particular audience still, but not so much in the letter format because it lacks the epistolary beginning that we would see from a regular letter. Finally, with respect to Hebrews, recognize that it consists of escalating warnings against apostasy. So they get, starts out a little bit, don't apostatize, and then don't apostatize, like that. It gets stronger as they go. And one of the strongest ones is, it's impossible. It's impossible to be restored to faith if once you fall away. Yeah, we have to understand this is a sermon, and impossible, the word impossible, it's not talking from a theological perspective. It's talking from a personal perspective or a pragmatic perspective. It's just unthinkable, something like that. It just can't happen. It just doesn't happen. So the warning is so strong because the preacher is so keen to keep the parishioners faithful. They don't want them to fall away, to return to Judaism. Stay faithful to Christ. So he's arguing this with everything that's in him. We can say him because at one point there's a personal description that uses a masculine pronoun. So yeah, it's a man on this one. He's so keen to keep his people faithful that he uses strong language because he has witnessed that when people do fall away, they've never come back. Not because God says, you can't come back, excluded. No, it's because once they've turned their back, they just don't come back again. It's a personal thing. So that warning, it's really important to understand how those are functioning in Hebrews. When we look at James, once again, it really lacks many of the expected elements of a Greco-Roman letter. So it's difficult to say it's a letter in the traditional sense. Of course, it's still described as epistle because of where it falls in the canon. But it's probably better not to try to read it as a letter. Another really interesting thing about James, it's sometimes argued that it should be understood as a chiasm. What's a chiasm? A chiasm is listing elements in one order and then listing them again in reverse order. Chiasm comes from the Greek letter chi, which is just like our x. So you can see how x goes this way first and then that way second. Reverse order. So one order and then second order. I've got a little graphic here for you to see. A, and then B, and then C, followed by B prime. So B and B prime are matched. Not to say that they're exactly the same words, but they're the same idea or related ideas. And then A prime matching back up to A. Related ideas again. In that illustration, I have C all by itself. In an extended chiasm like this that I'm giving the example, it's very frequent that there is an unmatched element in the center. We can call that the focus of the chiasm. It's the most important piece of the whole chiastic structure, and everything is pointing to that point, to that idea. Some people have read James that way, and I invite you to explore that thought. Looking at 1st and 2nd Peter, we can mention that it's among the best Greek in the New Testament. If you have the privilege of reading the New Testament in Greek itself, you will readily see this. It's complicated. It's complex sentence structures, very refined way of expressing things. One of the consequences of that is that many scholars would say, Peter didn't write these. It's not the only reason, be clear on that, but it's one of the reasons that they say, Peter is described as unschooled. Unschooled, he's this fisherman. How did he get to know such good Greek? Better than Paul. Paul grew up in Greek-speaking area. He and trained so well, so highly educated. And yet, Peter's Greek is better? More refined, more literary? There's ways around it, around that argument, but there is a certain power that comes from that. So, when you read the Pauline Epistles, as I mentioned in another video, don't be overconfident in your designation of Peter as the author, but ask, what's going on? Is it really Peter? Maybe yes, maybe no, according to your study of that. But if it wasn't really Peter, but it still says Peter, why? Ask that question. Looking at Jude, what I just said about Peter, double that, sort of, for Jude. Jude is I think, the hardest Greek in the New Testament. It's really complex, difficult, unusual words. Some people, beginning Greek students, they think, I want to read something short. I want to read the shortest thing in the New Testament. I'm going to read Jude. Oh, mistake, my Greek students. Don't start in Jude. It's so difficult. But it's also important to recognize that Jude bears many similarities with 2 Peter. In fact, almost all of Jude can be found in 2 Peter. 2 Peter is longer, so there's more stuff in 2 Peter that aren't in Jude, but almost all of Jude is there. Not quite all, but almost all. So it's very possible that the author of 2 Peter used the book of Jude as a source in writing. So that's a fascinating idea to explore as you interpret these books. So as you interpret the Catholic epistles or the General Epistles, I've mentioned that a lot of them aren't really letters, or don't seem to be so much letters. But please understand that you still should read them as historically contingent documents, meaning to say they were written for the first century. They're not written for us. Yes, they're written for us by extension, and they have a message for us, to be sure. But remember that they're written first for the first century. So we need to take seriously their historical situation. What was their historical situation? We need to work on that. Understand that very carefully. Also, we should read them canonically. That is to say, how are they related to the other epistles and the rest of the New Testament? What is their distinctive contribution? And finally, read them contextually. Pay attention to how the author is developing his or her thought. How are they shaping it? How are they communicating their ideas? When we get to that, when we take all of these things into consideration, we can hear God's Word to us.